There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with making an entire planet laugh. It is the loneliness of a man standing in a spotlight so blinding that no one can see the tears running down his face. Jim Carrey has spent more than 4 decades being the funniest person in any room he ever walked into. He contorted his face into shapes that seemed physically impossible. He invented voices, characters, and entire worlds out of thin air. He made hundreds of millions of people forget their troubles, if only for 2 hours at a time. And while they were busy laughing, nobody thought to ask him how he was doing. Not really. Not deeply. Now, at 61 years old, Jim Carrey has finally decided to tell the truth. All of it. And what he has revealed is not the story of a man born to make people laugh. It is the story of a boy who learned that laughter was the only armor strong enough to survive what life kept throwing at him. Jim Carrey was born on January 17, 1962, in Newmarket, Ontario, Canada, the youngest of 4 children in a household where love was abundant, but money was always terrifyingly scarce. His father, Percy Carey, was a man of genuine artistic soul. Percy played the saxophone and had the heart of a musician, the kind of man who could fill a room with warmth when the mood was right. But artistic souls do not always pay the rent, and Percy eventually traded his saxophone for an accounting ledger, taking a job at Titan Wheels in Scarborough to keep his family fed. It was a practical decision, but it was also a quiet surrender, and young Jim watched that surrender happen in slow motion across the years of his childhood. His mother, Kathleen, fought chronic illness throughout Jim's entire upbringing, spending more days confined to bed than she spent on her feet. The household ran on anxiety, on the silent prayer that nothing would go wrong, because there was absolutely no cushion for anything going wrong. Jim found his escape early. By the age of 8, he had discovered that his face was a kind of instrument. Standing in front of mirrors for hours at a time, he would twist and stretch his features into grotesque and hilarious shapes that made his siblings stop whatever they were doing just to stare. He was not simply goofing around. He was practicing. He was building something. At 10 years old, he sat down and wrote a letter to Carol Burnett, a woman he admired enormously, informing her with complete sincerity that he was already a master of impressions. The letter he received back was a polite, generic form response, but Jim Carrey taped it to his bedroom wall like it was a contract with destiny. That piece of paper meant that someone, somewhere in the entertainment world, had at least acknowledged that he existed. For a boy living under constant financial pressure, that was everything. Then the floor disappeared entirely. In 1975, Titan Wheels shut down without warning, and Percy Carrey, at 51 years old, found himself suddenly unemployed in an economy that had very little patience for middle-aged accountants starting over. He sent out application after application, dozens upon dozens of them, to accounting firms across Ontario, and received almost nothing back but silence and rejection letters. The family's savings evaporated. Kathleen's medical bills continued to accumulate. And Percy, a man who had once played jazz saxophone and dreamed of something larger than a factory desk, took a job as a janitor earning $4 an hour, cleaning toilets and mopping floors in the very same kinds of industrial buildings where he had once worked as a professional. Jim was 13 years old when he watched his father do that. He watched the man he admired more than anyone else in the world carry a mop through corridors where other men used to shake Percy's hand as an equal. That image burned itself into Jim permanently. It taught him something that no classroom ever could: that dignity is fragile, that the world does not owe anyone stability, and that the distance between respected professional and invisible laborer can collapse in a single afternoon without warning. Within months of Percy losing his position, the family lost their home entirely. From roughly 1974 through 1976, the Carey family lived in a yellow Volkswagen camper van parked near Lake Ontario. Percy and Kathleen slept inside the van, while Jim and his brother John slept in a tent pitched beside it through the brutal Canadian winter. They woke up with frost crystals on their sleeping bags. They washed their faces in gas station bathrooms. Before school, Jim would sometimes find expired sandwiches near dumpsters and bring them back to warm over the van's small stove. The whole family worked night shifts together at a local factory, cleaning floors and bathrooms for a combined $32 over 8 hours of labor. Jim attended Aldershot High School during the day, exhausted and hollow, wearing unwashed clothes, trying to hold himself together inside a classroom while his real life existed in a tent beside a camper van. What kept Jim Carrey alive during those years was not hope, exactly. Hope implies a belief that things will get better. What Jim had was something more desperate and more durable than hope. He had humor. When his mother's illness worsened to the point that she could no longer walk on her own, Jim became her primary caretaker. He would come home from night shifts at the factory, lift her from bed, wash her, prepare her food, and then sit beside her and tell jokes until she laughed. Kathleen called him her little sunshine. She meant it with all the love a mother can carry. But Jim later admitted that behind every joke he told her was a wall of terror he was holding back with his bare hands. He was 16 years old, doing the work of an adult caretaker, and using comedy as a form of emergency medicine, both for his mother and for himself. By the time he was 17, he had earned his first professional payment for comedy, $20 for a 20-minute set at a small club. It was not a triumph by any conventional measure, but it was proof. It was the first real evidence that the thing he had been doing in mirrors since he was 8 years old had actual value in the actual world. When he auditioned for Saturday Night Live in 1980, he was convinced that everything was about to change. He was wrong. The producers passed on him without even arranging a meeting with Lorne Michaels. The rejection was delivered casually, almost carelessly, with a simple assessment that Lorne probably would not like what he saw. Jim Carrey carried that particular sting for years afterward, but he also understood in retrospect that the rejection forced him to stop doing impressions of other people and start inventing characters entirely his own. What Jim Carrey has finally been willing to discuss openly, now that he has stepped back from the relentless machinery of Hollywood, is the psychological cost of everything he endured before he ever became famous. He has spoken in recent years about being on Prozac since the late 1980s, managing what he describes as a persistent low-level despair that never fully went away, no matter how successful he became. The medication helped, he has said, but it also flattened him in ways that troubled him deeply. He eventually chose to step away from it and try to manage his mental state through other means, but the underlying struggle remained constant. Depression is not something that dissolves when a person wins a Golden Globe or earns $20 million per film. It follows its own logic entirely, indifferent to applause and box office numbers. The event that perhaps shaped Jim Carrey's psychology more than any other happened in 1982. He came home to find his father, Percy, unconscious in the bathroom, having swallowed a bottle of pills. Jim was 20 years old. He screamed into the telephone for help, while paramedics rushed to the scene, and Percy was taken to hospital, where he survived by what the doctors described as a matter of minutes. In the aftermath, Percy admitted to his son that this had not been his first attempt. He had tried at least twice before, during the years the family had been living in the van. Jim Carrey had been sleeping in a tent through a Canadian winter during periods when his father was secretly attempting to end his life nearby. That knowledge reorganized everything inside Jim. It planted in him a fear he has never been entirely able to shake, the fear that the same darkness his father carried might live somewhere inside him as well. He has spoken about this fear in interviews with a candor that most public figures would never allow themselves. He described it as one of the primary engines behind his relentless work ethic. If he kept moving fast enough, making enough noise, filling enough silence with characters and voices in physical comedy, maybe the darkness would not be able to get a foothold. It was not a strategy he chose consciously. It was a survival mechanism that had been running since childhood and simply never stopped running. When Jim Carrey joined In Living Color in 1990, he was 28 years old, and finally, undeniably, impossibly funny in a way that television had never quite seen before. He created over 120 sketches across 5 seasons. His character Fire Marshal Bill, with a face that appeared to have survived some catastrophic accident, and an energy that suggested a complete disconnection from ordinary human behavior, became one of the most memorable recurring characters in sketch comedy history. Jim was physically reckless in ways that alarmed the people around him. He would slam himself into furniture, twist his body into configurations that caused real pain, change his weight dramatically from week to week, as different characters demanded. He broke his ankle during one sketch in 1992 and continued working through the rest of the week without stopping. Pain was simply another costume he put on and wore without complaint. But the personal cost was compounding rapidly. His first marriage, to Melissa Womer, who had known him before the fame arrived and had seen the person underneath the performance, began to collapse under the weight of everything his success had introduced into their lives. Late nights, poor decisions, a growing emotional distance that Jim himself seemed unable to close. They divorced in 1995 after she filed, citing fundamental incompatibility with the man he had become. Jim has spoken about this period without defensiveness, acknowledging that fame did something to him that he was not equipped to manage, and that the people closest to him paid a price they had not agreed to pay. Then came 1994, which was, by any commercial measure, one of the most astonishing single years any comedian has ever had. Ace Ventura: Pet Detective was released in February on a budget of $15 million and earned over $70 million domestically. The Mask followed and earned $350 million globally. Dumb and Dumber closed out the year and added another $270 million worldwide. Jim Carrey had gone from struggling television comedian to the highest-paid comedic actor on the planet within roughly 12 months. Studios that had previously ignored him were now offering him $20 million per film, a figure that had barely been reached by anyone in Hollywood at that time. And yet, during the promotional tour for Dumb and Dumber, he suffered what he later described as a nervous breakdown. He reported hallucinations. He admitted to cocaine use that had been ongoing for some time, fueled initially by the brutal schedule of weekly television production, and then carried forward by momentum and desperation. He called himself, in one interview from that period, a manic, depressive clown. He said he felt like he was wearing a mask, and he was not referring to the green CGI face from the film. He was referring to the performance of happiness that he delivered every time a camera turned in his direction, while something very different was happening underneath. The Truman Show in 1998 represented a fundamental shift in what Jim Carrey was willing to ask of himself and what audiences were willing to believe him capable of. The film told the story of a man who discovers that his entire life has been a manufactured television program, that every relationship he has ever had was scripted, and that the world he believed in does not exist. It was, for Jim Carrey specifically, a story with a resonance that went far beyond the pages of the script. He had spent decades performing a version of himself for public consumption. He understood on a cellular level what it meant to live inside a constructed reality and wonder what was genuine underneath it. He refused to leave the set between shooting days, wanting to inhabit the isolation that the character would feel. He barely communicated with people outside the production. He pushed for creative control in ways that created genuine friction with director Peter Weir. When he won the Golden Globe for Best Actor for that performance, it was not simply an industry acknowledging good work. It was a signal that the boy from the camper van in Ontario had developed into something that could not be easily categorized or dismissed. 1 year later, he did it again with Man on the Moon, playing the legendary and deliberately strange comedian Andy Kaufman. He lost 40 pounds for the role. He watched footage of Kaufman until the man's rhythms and habits and particular brand of bewildering performance lived in his body as naturally as his own. He stayed in character between takes, in rehearsals, in meetings, in conversations with co-stars who found the whole experience genuinely unsettling. He won his second consecutive Golden Globe, but the process had cost him his second marriage to actress Lauren Holly, who said that Jim had become emotionally unreachable during the production and remained so long afterward. A documentary filmed during the making of that movie was considered so raw and so disturbing that it was kept locked away from public view for nearly 20 years before finally being released. What it showed was not a man acting, it was a man disappearing. At 61 years old, Jim Carrey has removed himself from most of the Hollywood machinery that defined the first 3 decades of his career. He has spoken publicly about finding meaning in painting, producing large, vivid, sometimes deeply unsettling canvases that express things his films never quite could. He has spoken about spirituality, about the nature of identity, about his growing belief that the self is largely a construction, and that the attachment most people feel to their public image is a source of profound suffering. These are not the observations of a man performing wisdom for an audience. They are the hard-won conclusions of someone who has lived inside the machinery of fame long enough to understand exactly what it costs and exactly what it takes from you when you are not paying attention. He has been honest about the depression in ways that carry no trace of self-pity. He has described it as a companion. He has learned to live alongside rather than something he has conquered or left behind. He has spoken about his father's suicide attempts with a gentleness and a grief that suggest he has spent considerable time making peace with that history, without ever fully arriving at peace. He has acknowledged the addiction, the broken marriages, the physical damage he inflicted on himself in service of characters that audiences loved, and he himself sometimes found hollow. He has said more than once that the Jim Carrey the world fell in love with was never entirely real, that behind the elastic face and the manic energy was a frightened kid from Ontario who discovered very early that making people laugh was the one reliable way to make the world feel survivable. What strikes people most about Jim Carrey's late career honesty is not any single revelation, but the cumulative weight of the picture it paints. Here is a man who survived genuine poverty, homelessness through a Canadian winter, a father's multiple attempts at suicide, a mother's chronic illness and subsequent addiction to painkillers, his own addiction, 2 divorces and a decades-long private war with depression, and who somehow transformed all of that raw, unrelenting suffering into performances that made the rest of the world feel lighter. The rubber face was never just a gift. It was a tool that a desperate child built to keep himself alive and then carried with him all the way to the top of the world. Jim Carrey has said that he is done performing, not just done with films, but done with the version of himself that the entertainment industry required him to maintain for so many years. Whether or not that is entirely true, what feels absolutely true is that he has finally stopped performing the story of his own life, the carefully managed public image, the persona of the unstoppable madman who was born funny and would die funny, has given way to something quieter and far more human. A man who laughed because it was the only weapon he had. A man who made the whole world laugh while he was quietly falling apart inside. A man who, at 61, has finally decided that the truth is less frightening than the performance he has been giving since he was 8 years old standing in front of a mirror.